A long time ago, in a small village in Africa, there lived a poor farmer named Kofi. Kofi was a very hard-working man, toiling tirelessly on his farm day and night. But no matter how hard he worked, the harvest was never enough. His crops would often wither under the scorching sun or drown in the sudden heavy rain that plagued the village. Kofi's clothes were tattered, and he lived in a humble mud hut. He hardly had 3 square meals a day, and if he did, it was maybe just bone and maz. Despite his struggles, Kofi was known throughout the village for his kindness. Whenever his neighbors needed help, whether it was fetching water or mending fences, Kofi would be the first to lend a helping hand, even though his own fields were suffering. Every night, Kofi would sit on a wobbly stool outside his hut and gaze at the sky, wondering if the gods had forgotten him. One particular evening, as Kofi sat in the fading light of the setting sun, a feeling of hopelessness settled in his heart. He thought about how the rich chiefs in the village seemed to have everything they desired, while the poor like him toiled endlessly for so little. "Is this all life has to offer me?" he muttered to himself, feeling the weight of his burdens pressing upon him. But the next day, as Kofi made his way home from his barren field, something unusual caught his eye. Beneath the shade of a tall baobab tree, half buried in the earth, lay a peculiar-looking calabash. Its surface was smooth and polished, glistening even though there was no water nearby. Curious, the farmer knelt down and pulled it free from the ground. Just as Kofi held the calabash in his hands, a voice, soft but clear, echoed from within. "Do not be afraid, Kofi," it said, making the farmer stumble backward in shock. His heart pounded in his chest. Who is speaking to me?" Kofi stammered. "I am the spirit of this calabash," the voice replied. "I have watched over your village for centuries, and because you are a man of pure heart, I will grant you 3 wishes. But beware, Kofi. Each wish comes with a condition. If you act with greed or selfishness, the blessings will turn into curses." Kofi's eyes widened. Could this be true? Was this his chance to finally escape his life of poverty? But the warning from the calabash echoed in his mind, sending a shiver down his spine. He hesitated, then asked, "What must I do to earn these wishes?" "The conditions will be revealed when the time comes," the calabash answered. Torn between excitement and fear, Kofi carried the talking calabash back to his hut. That night he lay on his straw mat, staring at the ceiling, pondering what he could ask for. Should he wish for wealth, abundance in his fields, or perhaps something even greater? The possibilities swirled in his mind until sleep finally claimed him. The next morning, with the calabash resting on his table, Kofi spoke his first wish aloud. "I wish for my land to be fertile and for my crops to grow tall and strong." The calabash hummed for a moment before the voice spoke again. "Your wish is granted, Kofi. But remember, you must share half of your harvest with the poorest in the village." True to the calabash's words, within weeks Kofi's fields flourished. His maize stalks grew taller than any in the village, and his yams were so large that they needed 2 people to carry them. Neighbors came to marvel at his success, and soon he became the talk of the village. Kofi felt as though all his problems had been lifted off his shoulders. For the first time in his life, he experienced what it felt like to be a man of means. But he didn't forget his promise. As he had vowed, Kofi shared his bounty with the villagers who needed it most. His generosity earned him admiration, and people began seeking his counsel. However, as the months passed, Kofi began to notice a change in himself. He would hear whispers of envy from the villagers, and even though he had more than enough, the idea of giving half of his harvest away began to weigh on him. "Why should I give so much?" he found himself thinking one evening. "I work so hard, yet these people just take from me as if it's their right." This thought grew stronger as harvest season approached. While his barn was full, the temptation to keep the best produce for himself tugged at his heart. "It's not fair," he grumbled to himself. "I should enjoy the fruits of my labor." That night, as Kofi lay on his bed, he tossed and turned, thinking about the harvest he had to give away. The voice of the calabash echoed in his mind. Greed will turn blessings into curses. Still, Kofi could not shake off the resentment. The next morning, he made a decision. He would keep the larger portion of his harvest for himself and give only a small portion to the poorest villagers. His hand trembled as he did so, but deep down he knew it was wrong. The following day, a strange thing happened. A terrible drought struck the village, but strangely it only affected Kofi's field. While the other villagers still had enough water, Kofi's land became dry and cracked. His crops withered as if they had never been green. He tried to water them, but no amount of effort could revive the once lush fields. The Calabash spoke softly. "You have broken your promises, Kofi. Greed has darkened your heart, and now you face the consequences." Kofi fell to his knees, his heart heavy with regret. "I am sorry, I should have kept my word. Please give me one more chance." The Calabash remained silent for a long time before finally responding. "You still have 2 wishes, Kofi. But beware. Each decision you make from here will be more difficult than the last." Kofi hesitated, but he knew he had no choice. His crops were his livelihood. "For my second wish, I want wealth. Wealth in abundance, so that I will never have to farm again." The Calabash's voice was cold as it granted his wish. "Your wealth will come, Kofi, but you must not use a single coin for selfish reasons. If you do, all the gold will vanish." The next day, a stranger appeared at Kofi's door, carrying a sack of gold coins. He claimed to be repaying an old debt he owed Kofi's family. Now, with more wealth than he could ever imagine, Kofi built a grand house and no longer had to work in his fields. The villagers marveled at his good fortune, but just like before, temptation crept in. With so much gold at his disposal, Kofi began to think, "Why shouldn't I buy fine clothes and feast on the best food? I have earned this wealth. I have worked so hard for it." One evening, after hosting a lavish banquet for the village chiefs, Kofi decided to keep the remaining gold to himself. He ignored the Calabash's warning, convincing himself that a little indulgence wouldn't matter. But the next morning, to his shock, every single coin had disappeared. His grand house crumbled into dust, leaving him standing alone amid the ruins, just as poor as he had been before. Kofi's heart sank. He had used up 2 wishes, and the weight of his choices pressed heavily upon him. Now, with only one wish left, he realized how much was at stake: his integrity, his humanity, and perhaps even his very soul. As he sat in the shadow of the baobab tree, he wondered, what would he do next? He knew that one wrong choice could ruin him forever, but the right one might just save him. The voice of the Calabash echoed in his mind, silent for now, but watching and waiting. Kofi sat under the baobab tree, his hands trembling as he held the Calabash. His mind wrestled with thoughts of what his third and final wish should be. This time, there could be no mistakes. He knew that each of his previous wishes had led him to ruin because of his greed and pride. The lessons weighed heavily on his heart, but the temptation of one last chance still lingered. Looking around the village, the quiet fields, the humble huts, he wondered what he could wish for that wouldn't lead to more sorrow. His heart ached for the simplicity he once knew, but the thought of returning to the life of a poor and struggling farmer frightened him. He had tasted wealth, even if only for a short while, and the memory of it haunted him like a distant dream. For days, Kofi wrestled with his decision. He spoke to no one, wandering the outskirts of the village, hoping to find some kind of answer. But with each passing day, his desperation grew. He feared making the wrong choice again, but even more, he feared doing nothing and letting the opportunity slip away. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the village in hues of orange and gold, Kofi sat by a stream near his field. The water's gentle flow calmed his troubled mind. He had always found peace by the water, back when life was simpler and his heart was less burdened. Suddenly, a voice called out from behind him, "My friend." Kofi turned to see Kwame, one of the village elders, walking toward him. Kwame had always been a wise man, respected for his knowledge and kindness. Kofi hadn't spoken much to him since his fortunes had changed, but now seeing Kwame's familiar face brought a sense of comfort. "Kofi," Kwame said as he sat beside him, "you have been troubled. I can see it in your eyes. Tell me, what burdens your soul?" At first, Kofi hesitated. He didn't know if he could trust anyone with the secret of the Calabash, but something about Kwame's presence felt safe. So, after a long pause, Kofi told him everything: the Calabash, the wishes, the consequences he had faced for breaking the conditions. Kwame listened patiently, his expression never changing, even as Kofi poured out his regret and fear. When Kofi finished, the elder nodded slowly and said, "The heart can be a heavy thing, especially when it is filled with choices we wish we could undo. We could take back, but what should I do?" Kofi asked, his voice thick with desperation. "I only have one wish left. I am terrified of making another mistake." Kwame placed a hand on Kofi's shoulder and said, "The world has always been full of choices, my friend, but the most important ones are often the simplest. You must ask yourself, what is it that your heart truly needs? Not what your hands or eyes desire, but what will bring you peace." Kofi stared at the stream, the elder's words swirling in his mind. "What will bring me peace?" he thought. For so long, he had been chasing things, gold, wealth, abundance, but none of it had filled the emptiness in his heart. Days passed, and Kofi found himself contemplating Kwame's advice. Yet despite his longing for peace, the fear of poverty still haunted him. He had been poor for so long, and he was not sure he could return to that life. But more than the fear of poverty, he feared the Calabash. What if the final wish was his undoing? One stormy night, as the wind howled through the village, shaking the walls of his hut, the Calabash sat on the table, silent as ever. But Kofi could feel its presence looming over him. He got up from his mat and stood by the table, his hand hovering over the smooth surface of the Calabash. He knew what he wanted, but his heart still hesitated. His final wish had to be something pure, something that wouldn't invite disaster. "I wish," Kofi whispered, but his voice trailed off. He couldn't finish the sentence before he heard a loud knock at his door. Startled, Kofi rushed to open it, only to find a woman from the village standing in the rain, drenched and shivering. It was Adwoa, a widow who lived on the outskirts. She looked at Kofi with desperation in her eyes. "Please, Kofi," she begged. "My children are sick and we have no medicine. Please help, or they won't survive the night." Kofi's heart sank. He had nothing to offer her, no wealth, no food, no medicine. His riches had vanished and his fields were barren. The Calabash still had the power to change everything. But could he really use his last wish for someone else? What if he made the wrong decision? What if this wish led to more sorrow? Adwoa's pleading eyes cut through his thoughts. "Please, Kofi," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. For the first time, Kofi realized that perhaps the answer to his dilemma had been in front of him all along. He had been so focused on his own needs, his own desires, that he hadn't thought about what the village, the people around him, needed most. His last wish didn't have to be for himself, he thought. But even as the idea crossed his mind, a seed of doubt took root. What if helping Adwoa led to unforeseen consequences? The Calabash had proven to be as dangerous as it was powerful. Kofi had learned that wishes were never as simple as they seemed. He took a deep breath and turned to the Calabash on the table. "I will make my final wish," he thought. But just as he opened his mouth to speak, the Calabash's voice rang out, clear and sharp. "Kofi, be careful. This final wish will determine everything. Are you sure you know what you are asking for?" Kofi's heart pounded. He could feel the weight of the Calabash's words. His decision could shape the rest of his life, and perhaps the lives of those around him. The stakes had never been higher. He turned to Adwoa, who stood anxiously at the door, her eyes full of hope and fear. Could he make a wish that would save her children without condemning himself to more difficulties? Or was there a way to find balance between his needs and the needs of others? The storm outside raged on, thunder echoing through the village as Kofi stood frozen, torn between his choices. The Calabash's voice still echoed in his mind. "I wish," he began. But just as the words formed on his lips, he stopped. A new thought had entered his mind, one so simple, yet so profound, that it made him question everything he had considered up to this moment. What if he didn't wish for anything at all? Kofi stood frozen, the weight of his final wish bearing down on him like a storm cloud. The Calabash sat on the table, silent now, but its warning still echoed in Kofi's ears. Adwoa, drenched and desperate, stood by the door, her children's lives hanging in the balance. The question kept turning in Kofi's mind. What if I didn't wish for anything at all? Could that be the answer to breaking the Calabash's curse? Or would inaction be just as dangerous as a poorly made wish? But Adwoa's pleading eyes reminded him of his responsibilities, not just to himself, but to those around him. He had to act. Yet, Kofi had been so focused on his own needs, his own desires, that he hadn't thought about what the village, the people around him, needed most. His last wish didn't have to be for himself. But even as the idea crossed his mind, a seed of doubt took root. What if helping Adwoa led to unforeseen consequences? The Calabash had proven to be as dangerous as it was powerful. Kofi had learned that wishes were never as simple as they seemed. He moved slowly toward the table, his hands trembling as they hovered over the Calabash. His mind raced through every possible outcome. He knew deep down that he couldn't use his wish purely for his own gain. Not again. But perhaps, just perhaps, he could find a way to help Adwoa without repeating his past mistakes. Taking a deep breath, he finally spoke. "I wish for health, for Adwoa's children, and for all the children of this village, to be healthy, strong, and safe from illness." The room grew still, as if the very air had held its breath, waiting for the Calabash to respond. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Kofi's heart pounded in his chest, his hands slick with sweat. Then the Calabash's voice rang out once more, softer this time, but with a tone of finality. "Your wish is granted, but remember, Kofi, every wish carries a consequence. The path of the heart is never without cost." A chill ran down Kofi's spine, but before he could fully comprehend the words, the Calabash went silent. He turned to Adwoa, who stared at him with wide eyes, unsure of what had just happened. Suddenly, a sound filled the room, a sound Kofi hadn't heard in a long time, laughter, the laughter of children. He rushed outside, and to his amazement, he saw Adwoa's children, once pale and weak, now playing in the rain, their faces full of life and joy. "They are healed," Adwoa whispered, her voice trembling with disbelief. "They are really healed." Kofi smiled, relief flooding his heart. For the first time in a long while, he felt as though he had done something right. He had used his wish selflessly, for the good of others. But even as he watched the joyful scene, a nagging doubt crept into his mind. What did the Calabash mean by a consequence? The price of a wish. In the days that followed, Kofi's wish seemed to bring nothing but good. The children of the village, who had often fallen ill due to harsh conditions, were now strong and full of energy. Parents praised Kofi for his kindness, though none knew the true source of the miracle. For the first time in years, Kofi felt peace. His heart was lighter, and the fear of making the wrong choices had faded. He had used his final wish wisely, hadn't he? But soon, strange things began to happen. First, it was the animals. Goats, chickens, and cows began to fall ill, one by one, with a strange, unexplained sickness. Farmers were baffled. Livestock that had been healthy only days before were now weak and withering, their once strong bodies shrinking under the weight of some unknown disease. Next came the crops. Fields that had once thrived started to wither overnight, their leaves turning yellow and brittle. The rains, once welcome, began to flood the fields without warning, while other days were marked by punishing droughts. It was as if the villagers' blessings had turned against them. The children were healthy and full of life, but everything else was falling apart. Kofi watched in horror as the village descended into chaos. The very people who had praised him now looked at him with suspicion. Whispers began to spread. "It's Kofi's wish," they murmured. "It's the cause of all this." Kofi tried to convince himself that it wasn't his fault, that the Calabash's power had limits. But deep down, he knew. The consequences of his wish had taken hold. The Calabash had granted health to the children, but it had taken something in return. The balance of life had been disrupted, and the price was far higher than Kofi had ever imagined. Seeking redemption, desperate to undo the damage, Kofi returned to the great baobab tree where he had first found the Calabash. He held the cursed object in his hands, feeling its weight, heavier now than ever before. "Calabash," he pleaded, "you have taken enough. Please stop this madness. I wished for good, not for suffering." But the Calabash remained silent. Kofi's heart sank. There was no undoing his final wish. The Calabash had granted him 3 wishes, and now its power was spent. He was left to face the consequences of his choices, just as the Calabash had warned. But all was not lost. As Kofi stood beneath the baobab tree, staring over the withered fields, a thought began to form in his mind, one filled with both dread and hope. The Calabash was no longer speaking to him. But what if there was another way to restore balance to the village? What if the answers lay not in wishes but in the choices he made next? Kofi knew there were no more easy answers. His final wish had changed the village forever, and it was up to him to find a way to set things right. And so, with the Calabash in his hands, Kofi set off on a journey beyond the village, determined to seek out the wisdom of the ancient ones, the elders who had once told stories of magical objects and their dangerous powers. He didn't know what awaited him, or whether he could fix the damage his wish had caused, but he knew one thing for certain: this was only the beginning of his journey. The true test of his integrity and humanity lay ahead, and it would take more than wishes to bring peace to the village.